Your memory will live in our hearts.
She stood at her daughter's grave and cried real tears. She meant every word of the eulogy. What she didn't mention, what she made absolutely sure no one would ever find out, was that she was the reason her sister was in that casket at all. Except her sister wasn't in that casket. And in 5 weeks, a phone call from a recovery center 2 counties away was about to prove it. This is a story about 2 sisters, 1 inheritance, and a lie so carefully built that it took a coma, a forged signature, and a stranger's kindness to finally break it apart. Stay until the end, because the last document that surfaces in this case doesn't just change what happened on Route 9, it changes how a man died 6 years earlier, a man everyone believed took his own life. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you up at night in the best way, hit subscribe now, because you will not want to miss where this one ends up. Let's begin. To understand what happened on Route 9, you first have to understand the house where it started, a modest colonial on Maplewood Drive in Westerville, Ohio, where Robert and Diane Ashworth raised 2 daughters 7 years apart, and where, without either parent fully realizing it, they raised 1 daughter to expect love and 1 daughter to earn it. Vanessa Ashworth was born first, in 1988, into a household still finding its footing. Robert was building his insurance brokerage from a spare bedroom. Diane was finishing her teaching certification. Vanessa's earliest memories were of quiet, of being a well-behaved, watchful child in a house where both parents were exhausted and stretched thin. She learned early that good grades got noticed, that perfect posture at church got noticed, that being no trouble, ever, got noticed. In the narrow, conditional way, exhaustion notices anything. Then, in 1995, Emily arrived unplanned, and by every family account, an absolute delight from her first breath. She was an easy baby, a funny toddler, the kind of child who made strangers in grocery stores stop and smile. By the time the family's finances had stabilized and Robert's brokerage was thriving, Emily was the one getting piggyback rides in the front yard, the one whose report cards were taped to the refrigerator, not because they were exceptional, but because everything Emily did seemed to delight her parents, simply by virtue of being hers. Vanessa noticed. Vanessa always noticed everything. By the time Vanessa left for Ohio State at 18, she had already built an identity around a quiet, corrosive belief that she had done everything right and still finished second. She graduated with honors in accounting. She landed a respectable position at a mid-sized investment firm downtown. She was, by any objective measure, successful. But success, built on resentment, has a way of curdling, and Vanessa's resentment had 30 years to curdle. Quick note before we continue: if you're the kind of person who likes figuring out where a story like this is headed before the reveal, drop your theory in the comments right now. I'll tell you at the end how close you got. Robert Ashworth died in the spring of 2020, at 59, of what the coroner's report listed as an intentional overdose. The family was devastated in the particular, silent way families are devastated by suicide, nobody quite able to say the word out loud for months, everybody quietly wondering what they missed. In his will, Robert had established a trust for his daughters, a combination of life insurance proceeds, retirement accounts, and equity in the brokerage he'd spent 30 years building. The original documents, drawn up in 2016, when both daughters were adults, split everything evenly, 50-50, simple, clean. What almost no one knew, what would only surface years later, was that Robert had grown uneasy in his final year of life. Colleagues would later describe him as distracted, apologetic, prone to closing his office door for long phone calls he never explained. Diane assumed it was the stress of the business. She had no reason, at the time, to assume anything else. After Robert's death, Vanessa, already working in finance, already trusted implicitly by a grieving mother who leaned on her older daughter's competence, offered to help manage the estate paperwork so Mum doesn't have to deal with all this, on top of everything else. It was, on its face, a generous, dutiful gesture. Diane was grateful for it. Emily, 25 at the time and finishing her nursing prerequisites, was grateful for it too. What none of them knew was that Vanessa had already begun making small, careful adjustments, first to routine authorization forms, then, over the following 4 years, to the trust documents themselves. Using a notary contact from her firm, a man named Gerald Fenwick, who owed Vanessa a favor involving a compliance issue she'd once quietly buried for him, Vanessa filed 2 separate amendments to the trust. Both moved a larger share toward her. Both required Emily's signature. Both signatures traced from an old birthday card, practiced in a notebook Vanessa kept locked in her desk at work, were forged. It worked. For 4 years. Because no one was looking. Grief makes people trust the person who seems to be handling things. Then, in the late summer of 2024, Emily noticed a discrepancy in a quarterly statement that didn't match what she remembered signing. If you're new here, this is the part of the video where things start moving fast, which means it's also the perfect time to subscribe, so you don't miss part 2 of this story when it drops. Now, back to Emily. Emily Ashworth was not, by nature, a suspicious person. She was, by every account from friends and co-workers, warm, a little disorganized, the kind of person who forgot to check her mailbox for a week at a time. But nursing school had taught her one habit that would end up mattering more than anyone could have predicted. She double-checked numbers. It was drilled into her on every clinical rotation medication dosages, patient charts, lab values. Numbers that didn't match required an explanation, not an assumption. So when a quarterly trust statement arrived, showing a distribution percentage that didn't match her memory of the original 2016 documents, Emily didn't dismiss it. She pulled the paperwork from a filing cabinet at her mother's house, spread it across the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in September, and read through 4 years of amendments with a growing, sick feeling in her stomach. Her signature was on 2 of them. She had never signed either. Emily didn't confront Vanessa immediately. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it says everything about who Emily was. She was careful. She wanted to be sure before she accused her own sister of forgery. She contacted a family law attorney, a woman named Patricia Reyes, in downtown Columbus, and scheduled a consultation for the following week. She told almost no one, not her mother, not yet, not until she had something concrete. She mentioned it only to her college roommate, Casey, in a text message that would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. "I think Vanessa's been messing with Dad's trust. Meeting with a lawyer Tuesday. Don't say anything to Mum yet. I don't want to blow this up if I'm wrong." She wasn't wrong. What Emily didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the family attorney's office still had Vanessa listed as an authorized contact on shared estate files from years earlier, an administrative oversight nobody had thought to correct. When Emily's consultation request came through, requesting copies of the trust amendments, an assistant at the firm, following outdated protocol, sent a courtesy notification to all authorized parties on file. Vanessa received that notification on a Thursday afternoon at her office desk. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop, sat very still for almost 10 minutes, and began, methodically, to plan what she would later tell investigators was just a conversation, one she needed to have with her sister before Emily did something that would tear this family apart. Here's a question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments. If you were Emily, having just found proof your own sister forged your signature, would you have confronted her directly or gone straight to the lawyer, the way Emily did? I'll be reading through your answers, so let me know. The night of October 3rd was clear, cold, and unremarkable, the kind of Ohio autumn night that thousands of people drove through without incident. Emily had spent the evening at her apartment in Zanesville, finishing a shift at the coffee shop, where she worked part-time, and was driving home along Route 9 around 9:30 p.m. after picking up dinner. Vanessa had left work early that day, telling colleagues only that she had a family thing. Cell tower data, which investigators would later pull as part of the reopened case, placed her phone traveling east along Route 9, starting at 9:15 p.m., trailing roughly a quarter mile behind a vehicle matching Emily's. What happened between 9:40 and 9:47 p.m. exists, to this day, in two very different versions. Vanessa's version, given later to investigators through her attorney, was this. She had followed Emily, intending only to talk, to convince her sister to drop the lawyer and handle this as a family. She claims Emily sped up when she recognized Vanessa's headlights in her mirror. She claims she followed too closely, panicked, and made contact with Emily's rear bumper, never intending harm, only trying to get her sister to pull over. Emily's fragmented memory, recovered slowly over the following months, tells a colder story. Headlights closing in fast behind her on a dark stretch of road with no other cars in sight. A hard, deliberate impact, not a nudge, but a push, hard enough to send her car into a skid. The guardrail giving way. Then nothing. What is not in dispute because physical evidence confirmed it is what happened next. Emily's car went through the guardrail and down a ravine embankment roughly 40 feet off the roadway, coming to rest against a stand of trees that likely saved her life by slowing the vehicle's descent. She was thrown partially from the car on impact, landing in brush below the sightline of the road, unconscious, bleeding, but alive. At almost the exact same time, a coincidence, investigators would spend months untangling a 29-year-old rideshare driver named Sarah Kucharski, who had witnessed the collision from a distance while driving the opposite direction, pulled over to help. Sarah was a mother of one, a former veterinary technician who'd taken up rideshare driving to cover expenses while she finished a certification program. She was, by every account from people who knew her, exactly the kind of person who would stop. As Sarah approached the guardrail on foot with her hazard lights flashing behind her, a second vehicle never identified, never located, a hit-and-run that remains a separate open case to this day, struck her on the shoulder of the road and did not stop. Vanessa arrived at the scene on foot moments later, having pulled over just up the road after the collision with her sister's car. What she found, in the dark, in the chaos, was a scene almost too horrific to process. Her sister's car in the ravine, and a woman on the roadside who had just been struck and killed, wearing, by devastating coincidence, a jacket nearly identical to one Emily owned, thrown from the impact several yards from a purse. Vanessa did not call 911 immediately. She would later claim she was in shock. Cell records show a 7-minute gap between the estimated time of the second collision and her eventual call. In those 7 minutes, prosecutors allege, Vanessa made a decision that would define the rest of this story. She recognized what the scene would look like to first responders. She recognized that Sarah's body, badly injured and difficult to immediately identify, was positioned near Emily's wrecked car. She saw Emily's cracked driver's license, thrown clear of the wreck, lying in the grass. And in those 7 minutes, prosecutors argue, though Vanessa's defense disputes the timeline she placed that license into Sarah's purse, she never looked for her sister in the ravine. If this part is hitting you hard, that's exactly why this story needs to be told carefully and completely, which is what the rest of this video is going to do. If you haven't already, subscribe now, because the investigation that follows is even harder to watch unfold than what you just heard. Emergency responders arrived at 10:02 p.m. Sarah Kucharski was pronounced dead at the scene. The vehicle in the ravine was confirmed, based on registration and the license found nearby, to belong to Emily Ashworth. Given the severity of the crash and the state of the remains, the medical examiner's office would later admit this was a contributing factor in the misidentification. Visual identification was not possible. Dental records were requested as standard protocol. This is the detail that haunts everyone who worked this case afterward. Muskingum County's medical examiner's office was, at the time, operating with 2 of its 4 forensic odontology consultants out on medical leave. The dental record request for Emily Ashworth was processed against an outdated file, one that had, through a clerical transcription error made months earlier during a routine records digitization project, been mislabeled and cross-filed under a similar case number belonging to an unrelated prior file review. The record that came back appeared to confirm the identification. It was wrong, and in the chaos and grief of the following 72 hours, no one caught it. Diane Ashworth was notified by a sheriff's deputy at 11:40 p.m. that night. What followed the identification, the funeral home arrangements, the closed casket necessitated by the crash, and the fire that had partially engulfed the vehicle, all proceeded under the devastating, false certainty that Emily was dead. Vanessa said nothing, not that night, not in the days that followed, not when her mother, hollow-eyed and barely functioning, asked Vanessa to help pick a casket because she couldn't bring herself to do it alone. Not when 200 people gathered under a grey October sky to say goodbye to a woman who was, at that exact moment, alive and unidentified in a hospital bed 60 miles away, having finally been found by a highway maintenance crew, clearing brush from the ravine 2 days after the crash, 5 days before the funeral, and transported, disoriented and without ID, to the nearest facility equipped to handle her injuries, Willowbrook Recovery Center, in Zanesville. Vanessa gave the eulogy. She talked about closeness. She talked about forgiveness. She talked about taking care of their mother, now that it's just the two of us. A line that, heard again later, with full knowledge of what Vanessa had done, would sit in Diane's stomach like a stone for the rest of her life. I want to pause here and ask you honestly, because I think this is the moment that separates people who could understand desperation from people who could never forgive what came next. Type stone in the comments if this is the moment you started hating her. I want to see how many of you felt it exactly here. While Diane grieved, Emily lay in room 214 at Willowbrook, unidentified for 5 days, then slowly, painstakingly, beginning to reconstruct a name, a fragment of memory, a mother's face she couldn't yet fully place. Traumatic brain injuries of the severity Emily sustained do not resolve on a Hollywood timeline. There is no single dramatic moment where the fog lifts. There is only a slow, frustrating, non-linear climb, a name recalled one day, forgotten the next, a face in a dream that takes 3 more days to attach to a memory that finally holds. Nurse case manager Renata Cole, the woman who would eventually make the phone call that changed everything, later described Emily's early days at Willowbrook this way: patient, kind, endlessly apologetic for not knowing things she had no way of knowing. She kept apologizing to us, Renata said, for not being able to tell us who she was, like it was rude of her. It took 3 weeks before Emily produced a full name that staff could search. It took 2 more days to locate a matching missing persons report, except there wasn't one, because no one was looking for Emily. Everyone who loved her believed she was already found, already identified, already buried. It was only through a secondary trace hospital billing software, cross-referencing a partial Social Security number fragment Emily had recalled against state records, that Renata's team found a Diane Ashworth listed as next of kin on an old medical form from years earlier, still on file from a prior hospital visit. Renata made the call on a Thursday evening. She would later tell reporters it was one of the hardest phone calls of her career, because she had absolutely no way to soften what she had to say. I think the daughter you buried might still be alive. This is the part of the story most people can't believe is true, and it is. Records from Willowbrook and the sheriff's office confirm this timeline. If you want to see how this story gets even more complicated in the courtroom, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to get into the investigation. We covered this reunion briefly before, but it deserves the full weight it carries. Diane arrived at Willowbrook just after 11 p.m., having driven 90 minutes in a state she would later describe as outside my own body. She remembers almost nothing of the drive. She remembers everything about the hallway. When she stepped into room 214, she found her daughter exactly as we described, thinner, marked by a healing scar along her hairline, disoriented, but unmistakably, impossibly Emily. The small chipped tooth, the freckles Diane used to trace as a colicky infant, a face that should have been 6 feet underground and was instead blinking awake under fluorescent hospital lighting, saying, "Mum," like she wasn't sure the word would still work. There is no adequate way to narrate the next several minutes. Diane has since described it, in the one interview she's given about this case, as the only time in my life I have ever felt two completely opposite things with the same amount of force: overwhelming relief, and a terror that hadn't fully formed yet, but was already circling. It formed fully when she pulled back, held her daughter's face in both hands, and asked the question that had been sitting, unspoken, underneath the joy of the reunion, since the moment she walked in. "Baby, if you're here, then who did I bury?" Emily's answer halting, incomplete, but devastatingly clear, on one specific point, named her sister. "I remember Vanessa's car, behind mine, on Route 9. I remember she wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that road that night." Diane called the sheriff's office from the parking lot before she even sat back down in her car. Detective Marcus Whitlow had worked the original Route 9 crash 5 weeks earlier as a routine, tragic single-vehicle fatality, the kind of case that generates a report, a condolence card from the department, and no further questions. When Diane's call came through just before midnight, patched to his cell phone by an on-duty dispatcher who recognized the case number and knew it needed immediate attention, Whitlow's first instinct, by his own later admission, was disbelief. "You don't get calls like that," he told a local news outlet months later. "You get calls about crimes in progress. You don't get calls about the dead undying. I drove out there, assuming there'd been some kind of mistake on the family's part. I was the one who was wrong." What followed was 5 weeks of methodical, unglamorous investigative work, the kind that rarely makes for exciting television, but is exactly how cases like this actually get solved. Whitlow requested a re-examination of the original dental records used for identification and quickly uncovered the clerical mislabeling that had caused the fatal misidentification in the first place. He located Sarah Kucharski's family, who had filed a missing persons report the same week as Emily's funeral, a report that had gone unresolved for over a month due to a jurisdictional mix-up between two counties, a second administrative failure layered on top of the first. Delivering that news to Sarah's mother and young daughter was, Whitlow later said, the hardest conversation of his career, harder, even, than arresting Vanessa. Cell tower data placed Vanessa's phone in the vicinity of the crash at the critical window. Text records recovered Emily's message to her college roommate, Casey. "I think Vanessa's been messing with Dad's trust, establishing motive with chilling clarity." And Emily's returning memory, corroborated independently across multiple interviews conducted weeks apart to rule out suggestion or contamination, consistently placed Vanessa's car on Route 9 that night. Whitlow secured an arrest warrant on a Monday. He executed it the following Tuesday morning. "We're getting close to the arrest now, and I promise you, the way it happened is not what you're expecting. But before we get there, if this story has earned it, hit that subscribe button, because there's a twist coming in the final 10 minutes of this video that changes everything you think you understand about this family." Vanessa Ashworth was arrested at 9:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in November at her downtown Columbus office, in front of colleagues who had spent the last 5 weeks quietly bringing her coffee, checking in on her, treating her with the careful gentleness people extend to someone grieving a sister. She did not run. She did not resist. Witnesses in the office described her as eerily composed standing when the detectives approached her desk, asking only, "Can I get my jacket?" before being led out in handcuffs past a floor of co-workers who watched in stunned silence. She has not, to date, offered a full confession. Her attorney has signaled a defense strategy built around distinguishing between the crash itself, which they intend to argue was a moment of panic, not premeditated harm, possibly even arguing for a lesser charge related to reckless behavior rather than an intentional act, and the aftermath, which is far harder to explain away, given the 7-minute gap in her 911 call, the relocated identification documents, and 5 weeks of silence through a funeral, a burial, and countless conversations with a grieving mother. The one statement Vanessa did make, caught on a colleague's cell phone video, and later played across local Ohio news broadcasts, has become the defining soundbite of this entire case. She was always going to ruin things for me. She always did. 7 words. A lifetime of resentment compressed into a single sentence, said not with hesitation, but with something closer to certainty, as if, even standing in handcuffs, some part of Vanessa still believed she had been the wronged party all along. I want to know, when you heard that line, what did you feel? Not what did you think, what did you feel? Comment 1 word below. I read every single one. This is the part of the story we promised you at the beginning, the part that turns this from a story about a car crash and a cover-up into something far larger. As part of the plea negotiation process, Gerald Fenwick, the notary who helped Vanessa forge the 2022 and 2023 trust amendments, came forward with information he had apparently been sitting on for years, hoping it would never surface. Facing his own potential charges for notary fraud, Fenwick made a deal with prosecutors, full cooperation, in exchange for reduced liability. What he handed investigators was not what anyone expected. Buried in a set of old digital files Fenwick had kept insurance, he later admitted, in case Vanessa ever tried to cut me out, was a scanned document dated 8 months before Robert Ashworth's death in 2020. It was a beneficiary change form for one of Robert's retirement accounts, notarized by Fenwick, altering distribution percentages in a way that closely mirrored the later trust amendments. The signature on that form was Robert's. Handwriting analysis, requested by investigators once the document surfaced, produced results that are still being formally finalized as of this recording, but preliminary findings, according to 2 sources close to the investigation, indicate meaningful inconsistencies with verified samples of Robert Ashworth's actual signature from the same time period. If that finding holds, it raises a question no one in this family has been prepared to ask. Was Robert Ashworth's death, in 2020, truly what everyone believed it was? Diane has not spoken publicly about this development. Detective Whitlow, when asked directly by a local reporter whether the Ashworth case might expand to re-examine Robert's death, offered only this: "There are aspects of this family's history we are actively reviewing in light of new information. I can't say more than that right now." And that's where this case stands today. Vanessa Ashworth is awaiting trial for the crash on Route 9 and related charges tied to the trust fraud. Emily continues her recovery, relearning parts of her own life, one memory at a time. And a 6-year-old death, long accepted as a tragedy no one could have prevented, may be about to be reopened as something else entirely. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with this story the way it deserves to be sat with. This isn't a case with a clean ending, yet Vanessa's trial is expected sometime next year, and the re-examination into Robert Ashworth's death is still in its earliest stages. When there's more to tell, we'll be the ones telling it to you. Before you go, subscribe, so you don't miss part 2 when the trial begins. And down in the comments, I want a real answer to this. Do you think Vanessa deserves any sympathy at all for who she became, or does what she did on Route 9 erase every excuse? Say your honest answer below, not what you think you're supposed to say. I'll be reading through them. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.